You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Monday, October 7th, 2024, marks the first anniversary of the Hamas attack on Israeli territory. Almost 1,200 Israelis were killed, the majority were civilians, and at least 100 are still being held hostage in Gaza. For a while, Israel's response to the violence supplanted the war in Ukraine in the headlines, but as the months dragged on, there were few significant updates to the stalemate between Israel and Hamas. That all changed in late September, when Israeli airstrikes in neighboring Lebanon killed 7 high-ranking commanders and officials from Hezbollah, including the militant group's leader, Hassan Nasrallah. According to scholar and Iran expert Trita Parsi, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has scored several points with a single blow. Hezbollah is severely degraded. Iran is on the defensive. The United States is closer to getting dragged into a regional war, and a Palestinian state is ever more distant. In the frantic days since, Hezbollah has sent hundreds of retaliatory missiles into Israel. Israeli ground forces have invaded southern Lebanon and are close-range fighting with Hezbollah. And the world is nervously waiting to see if a fuller-scale conflict could engulf the whole region and drag in the United States. Even as President Biden has said, he wouldn't support Israel attacking Iranian nuclear sites. And as G7 leaders have agreed to impose additional sanctions on Iran. A couple of days after the death of Hassan Nasrallah, I was joined by Trita Parsi. He gave me an update on the state of the conflict the same day Israeli troops entered Lebanon. When you hear this, the events on the ground are still developing. Trita Parsi. He's a founder of the National Iranian-American Council and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Parsi's latest book, Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Democracy, reveals the behind-the-scenes story of the nuclear deal with Iran. Trita Parsi, welcome back to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Well, the world never stands still, but you've got to admit, the tempo has been a little frantic since you were last on the program. As we talk, at the beginning of October, around the one-year anniversary of the Hamas attack on Israel, how do you assess the current situation in Israel and the wider region?
I think the region is in a very dire situation. Of course, from the Israeli standpoint, given the rather remarkable intelligence success they had, both with the pager bombs as well as with the assassination of the Hezbollah leader, 900 or so civilians, which is rarely mentioned in the media, there is a strong sense that Hezbollah is now on the back foot, that Israel has finally succeeded with a major military victory, which has largely been lacking in Gaza. And as a result, momentum is on the Israeli side, and this is likely going to make it even less likely than before that the Israelis would be willing to go along with some form of a ceasefire, whether in Lebanon or in Gaza. This then dramatically increases the likelihood or the risk that the Iranians will get dragged into the conflict, and then we will be seeing a much larger regional conflict that would be tremendously destabilizing, but also very likely to drag the U.S. into it as well.
If Israel is making war on Hamas and Hezbollah, should we really be calling this a proxy war on Iran?
Well, that would presume that Hezbollah and Hamas are Iranian proxies. And without a doubt, Iran's relationship with Hezbollah is extremely close. But there's clear differences between them. And I think right now we're seeing a situation in which there is probably a significant degree of frustration in Hezbollah because they would probably had hoped that Iran would have been more active in supporting them than Iran has been. Whether Iran has the capability, etc., is a different question. We can talk about that as well. In regards to Hamas, Hamas is not even close to being an Iranian proxy. They're part of the axis of resistance, as the Iranians call it. But Iran's relationship with Hamas has been a very shaky one from the very beginning. It started off actually as an enmity. Hamas sided with Saddam Hussein against Iran in the 1980s. Then, even though there was a rapprochement between them, they had a falling out over the Syrian civil war in which Hamas sided with the opposition, Iran sided with Bashar al-Assad. So it is nowhere near being a proxy. But I think there's an element of truth in what you're saying, in the sense that the actual players is not Hamas and Hezbollah from the Israeli standpoint. The actual player is Iran. They view Iran as being completely behind these two other actors, as well as the Houthis. I think that's a very oversimplified picture. But then from the Iranian side, the actual player is not Israel. The actual player is the United States. So then you would have to say that Israel is also a proxy, which I don't think many people in the United States would agree with.
In the attack that took the life of Hassan Nasrallah, one of the other people killed was said to be one of the commanders or the commander of the Quds force, a senior military Iranian official. There are regular ties between Hezbollah and Iran, right?
Oh, without a doubt. Iran played a crucial role in establishing Hezbollah back in 1982. Incidentally, something the Iranians had tried to do for some time without success, what actually gave them the success was Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. That actually led to a scenario in which the Shias in the southern part of Lebanon finally, from the Iranian perspective, recognized the need they had for an external player like Iran to play a bigger role in Lebanese politics. And this was all part of the Iranian strategy at the time to try to spread their revolution. This is only about 2.5 years after the Iranian revolution, and the Iranians had worked very hard and utterly unsuccessfully to spread their revolution by overthrowing other governments in the region. The only reason they were successful in Lebanon to a certain extent was partly because of the weakness of the Lebanese state and partly because of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. So it is undoubtedly a very close relationship. The Iranians are responsible for having turned Hezbollah into a rather potent fighting force. The technology they have, etc., is all ultimately coming from Iran. But you can also say that to a large extent about the United States' relationship with Israel, for instance. That does in and of itself not automatically turn the relationship into a proxy relationship.
It is notable that even after the direct exchange of fire between Israel and Iran, it looks like Iran has been moving pretty cautiously, even with all the punch and counterpunch that's been going on in the area. Is it because Iran has a lot to lose if it got into a sustained direct conflict with Israel?
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, contrary to how Iran oftentimes has been described in the Western narrative as a suicidal state that would never reject an opportunity to have a confrontation with Israel, for instance, we see quite the opposite in terms of their conduct. That's not to say that they are not tremendously motivated as an opponent of Israel. But it's a very different thing to be a suicidal state that as a result takes every opportunity to have a confrontation. On the contrary, part of the reason why the Israelis have had such challenges with Iran is precisely because it has been so calculating and it's been risk averse and been playing a long game. Now that long game, the Iranians may have lost now, because to have a long game also means that you need to have a short game. And the short game, the Israelis have been tremendously successful by weakening Hezbollah, hacking Hezbollah's communication system, which has made it very difficult for Hezbollah to be able to regroup. In some ways, it's actually similar to what happened in 2006 when Israel and Hezbollah were having a war, but in reverse, because back in 2006, it was actually the Hezbollah movement that managed to hack Israel's communication system, and that gave them a tremendous advantage over Israel, despite Israel's otherwise military superiority over Hezbollah.
Not all the intelligence is in, but it looks like the exploding walkie-talkies, pagers, and cell phones took out Hezbollah members up and down the organizational chain. And then, shortly thereafter, came the death of Hassan Nasrallah. What's the significance of Nasrallah's death? Is it still too soon to know?
It is obviously going to be a major blow for Hezbollah. He has been the leader since, I believe, 1992 or 1994, a very strong leader of that organization. Hezbollah does say, however, that they've been careful not to build an organizational structure that is entirely centered on him, meaning that if he, as well as many other leaders, were to be eliminated, the organization would still stand. We'll have to wait and see whether that is true or not, because Israel has been successful in not just taking out Nasrallah, but essentially the entire top echelon of the current leadership of Hezbollah. All of that, of course, is very significant. But I would still have to say, I think a greater significance is the manner in which Israel has been able to penetrate Hezbollah through human intelligence, have intelligence sources inside of Hezbollah, which Hezbollah has not yet been able to identify and outroot. And as a result, it makes it extremely difficult for Hezbollah to be able to regroup, particularly when you combine it with the fact that their communications have also been compromised. That, in many ways, is a bigger blow to Hezbollah than the elimination of the top leadership.
You mention a long game for Israel's part. A month away from national elections in the U.S., is Prime Minister Netanyahu and the War Cabinet attempting to put a set of realities in place in advance to strengthen Israel's hand no matter which candidate wins on November 5th. Does Benjamin Netanyahu and the War Cabinet, do they collectively want to create a set of circumstances where they are still in control of the destiny of that long war, no matter who wins on November 5th in the U.S.?
Oh, without a doubt. They want to make sure that they have the degree of deference that they're currently enjoying from the Biden administration. I think they were quite worried, at least earlier on, that a Harris victory could potentially lead to a change in the U.S.'s position. They don't seem to be particularly worried about what it will mean under Trump. However, I would have to say, if at any point Trump changes his mind and he believes that this is the time to end it, I think he has shown a different degree of willingness to use leverage and take his own red lines more seriously than what Biden has done. For the last 11 months, we've heard a lot about red lines that Biden has put in front of the Israelis, and then Israel has walked through them all. And then we hear a lot about how frustrated Biden is privately. But in action, the administration has continued to provide Israel with the weaponry, the money, the political, the diplomatic support to be able to continue policies that the Biden administration says that they're seeking to stop or avoid.
Even the small gestures that the Biden administration has taken from time to time, like stopping the supply of certain very heavy bombs, the blowback was significant. Maybe that has affected Joe Biden's thinking over the long haul.
Well, I think at the end of the day, if there really was any seriousness to prevent this from escalating further, if there was any seriousness to actually get a ceasefire, then a diplomatic approach that does not put any pressure on Israel, on the contrary, provides Israel with all the means it needs to ignore American desires, can ultimately not be seen as a serious effort. So we did see nothing in terms of actually withholding weaponry or even blocking the sales, even though State Department reports showed that given how the Israelis were conducting the war, it actually was illegal for the United States to provide them weapons because of the laws that we have when it comes to providing weapons to countries or entities that are engaged in war. And it was revealed by ProPublica that State Department had concluded this. But 2 days later, Tony Blinken went to Congress in a testimony and essentially appears to have lied about what the conclusions actually were. So given this, I don't think the Israelis in any way, shape, or form are worried about Biden. They may be worried about what the election result can bring about conclusions in the Democratic Party as to whether a Harris administration, if she wins, could continue the same path or whether it is too politically costly to do so.
Does the behavior of the Lebanese state, such as it is, have to be watched closely? If they come in on the side of Hezbollah, does that change the mathematics of going to war against Hezbollah?
Not significantly, because Hezbollah is much stronger than the Lebanese army. And as it seems like now, the Lebanese army has actually withdrawn from southern Lebanon. And as a result, it's only pockets of Hezbollah left there and civilian population. A lot of civilians have also fled north, but it's very difficult for them to flee since Lebanon was already in a very bad economic situation prior to this. We have also seen some Lebanese fleeing into Syria, which tells you something about how bad the situation in Lebanon has become, that people are choosing to flee into Syria. That is still in a state of civil war, even though it's not as intense as it was years ago. But I think the fact that the Lebanese military, at least for now, has withdrawn from southern Lebanon is an indication of how the rest of the Lebanese state, as much as they oppose what Israel is doing, are not in the mood of fighting the Israelis, knowing quite well that they do not stand a chance against Israel, particularly mindful of the fact that it is the United States that is providing Israel with all of these weapons, intelligence, political support, and it's also the United States that has trained the Lebanese army. If the United States is going to choose, it is not going to choose the Lebanese army.
Israel has sent ground forces into southern Lebanon and escalated airstrikes, including into Syria. It seems to me that the reaction this time, Trita, is very different from the reaction at the time of the last exchange of fire between Israel and Iran. Is that right? And why is it different?
I think you're quite right. If we take a look at the attack last time after the Israelis struck Iran's consular section of their embassy in Damascus, they shot about 300 projectiles, the majority of them slow-moving drones. Took about 8 hours for them to get to Israel. They telegraphed it 72 hours ahead of time. The Israelis knew exactly where they were going to hit. They got about 9 missiles through Israel's air defenses, and they used older missiles. This time around, they used hypersonic missiles. They've never shot those before. It was the first time I think both the US and Israel saw Iran using them and saw their capability. They clearly went through most of Israel's air defenses. The video footage shows quite a few of them hitting in air bases outside of Tel Aviv. But I think what caused them to do this time around is that the success Israel had in taking out Hezbollah and the bit of euphoria that it created in Israel and in parts of Washington. You had, for instance, Jared Kushner issue a tweet saying, Hezbollah is almost gone, Iran is a paper tiger, now's the moment to finish it, we have this opportunity to transform the Middle East. I think most American viewers by now have developed a certain sensitivity when any politician in Washington talks about transforming the Middle East. That's what got us into Iraq and everything else. But essentially a narrative was being created saying that it's actually relatively low cost to take out Iran at this point because of the defeat of Hezbollah or the perceived defeat of Hezbollah. On top of that, you had Netanyahu issuing a video message to the Iranian people, although it was in English with English subtitles, in which he essentially promised regime change in Iran. He had issued similar messages to the people of Lebanon before bombing Lebanon, to the people of Gaza before bombing Gaza. So I think the Iranians perceived the situation in which Israel was about to attack precisely because it thought that Iran is now so weak that it would be relatively cost-free to do so. And one other factor, of course, is that the White House came out and revealed that rather than actually trying to prevent this escalation, the White House had encouraged Israel to go into Lebanon, which flies in the face of what they've been saying for months, that they actually are opposed to such an escalation. I think all of this tipped the balance in the debate in Iran and caused them to do this attack and do it in such a way that was more than just a demonstration of force, but clearly signaling the ability of Iran to inflict severe costs on Israel if Israel escalates further.
As with the last confrontation between Israel and Iran, the United States used American assets on the side of the defense of Israel. So outwardly, it's not that different. Yet, the United States has also been pretty overt in the last several days, trying to contain the damage at where it is right now. Is that a tenable position for the United States?
I'm not actually entirely sure it has been the position. I mean, that has definitely been the discourse and the talking points. But when the White House, 6 people from the White House tell Politico that they actually encouraged Israel to attack Lebanon, completely in the face of earlier testimonies that a key objective of the US was to prevent the war in Gaza from getting into Lebanon. At one point, they're not telling the truth, essentially. They may be so that they changed their position, that they shifted. But also, I think there's another issue here. In April, Biden said, we will help defend Israel, but we will not engage in helping Israel's offensive operations. This time around, that's not what they're saying. Instead, they're saying that Israel has to respond and America will help ensure that happens, which suggests strongly a direct American involvement in Israel's attack against Iran, counterattack, however you want to describe it, which raises questions as to whether the United States has, the executive branch actually has the war authorization that the Constitution requires the presidents to get when it's actually going on an offensive campaign, going to war. The existing war authorizations, despite the fact that they're written in very broad ways, actually does not cover this. And there are murmurs now in Congress by some who want to challenge the administration on this point, because at the end of the day, there is a significant risk now that the United States will get dragged into a full-scale Middle East war.
And that's where I wanted to go next, about the risks of the current situation. We've had this exchange of fire. Iran said, look, you killed one of our generals. You have attacked assets of ours in other places in the world. Retaliation is legitimate. Is this objectively a different level of risk from what we saw in April, both in the region and involving Washington?
Absolutely, particularly mindful of the fact that the Biden administration appears to have shifted and is much more inclined to be directly involved. This is, I think, what Netanyahu wanted to drag the US into, to be on the verge of a full-scale war. I think Netanyahu also calculates that this is going to be much more suitable for him because it will help Trump get elected. It will be a negative for Harris in the elections. The fact that the Biden administration seems to be completely oblivious to that dimension is very worrisome in my view, mindful of the fact that the administration itself has said that this election is about the survival of American democracy. If that's the case, that should take the top priority rather than allowing the US to get dragged into another war in the region.
Let me stop you right there. Oblivious or unwilling to publicly discuss that aspect of it? Do you think that they're really not aware of the electoral risks involved here?
You raise a very important point, and they may be very well aware. The question is, if that is the case, why is that not reflected in their actions? Because the strategy the administration has pursued has been to protect Israel when Israel escalates by deterring Iran, deterring the militias, deterring the Houthis, and I think that element is quite understandable and correct. However, if at the same time the US does not use any of its leverage to prevent Israel from escalating in the first place, and in fact is encouraging such an escalation, such as the one we saw in Lebanon, then the strategy the US is using is not one of containing the conflict. It is one that actually facilitates and fuels escalation by reducing the cost for Israel to escalate. There's a tremendous amount of question marks, and I think what a lot of people in Washington are asking themselves, mindful of the dramatic contradictions here, is anyone actually in charge at the White House right now?
In earlier conversations, in widespread speculation in Washington, there was always the undertow that this was an asymmetrical conflict, that Iran could only go so far because it simply wasn't equipped to go head-to-head with Israel. Has this latest barrage shown a willingness to take on the burden of risk, shown a willingness to confront Israel that maybe was not expected in earlier chapters of this conversation?
I think it's a great question. I don't think, however, that Iran necessarily is equipped to go to war with Israel. Israel is still militarily far superior. And let's not also forget Israel is a nuclear weapons state. Iran is not. I think what happened in the last 72 or so hours going back to what I said earlier on of how the Iranians perceived that Israel was about to attack them anyways because it believed that it was rather costless, that it led to a situation in which they perceived their options as being such that not taking action would be costlier and riskier than taking action. Because by taking this action, I think they're trying to send the message, sure, Israel is stronger, Israel can attack, but Iran can also inflict severe damage on Israel. So it will be a costly endeavor. You should think twice about it.
There have been significant recent changes at the top of the Iranian governmental structure. Is this important for domestic consumption as well?
I think the Iranian public has zero interest in a conflict with Israel. And I think the government, the regime, is quite aware of that. And this is part of the reason, one element as to why they, up until this point, have done everything they can. And I think in their view, they still are trying to avoid a direct confrontation. I mean, remember, Israel assassinated the leader of Hamas in Iran, in Tehran, on the day of Iran's presidential inauguration. And the Iranians did not respond. They say they didn't respond because the US and Europe told them we're on the verge of securing a ceasefire in Gaza. If you respond, you sabotage that. There was no ceasefire in Gaza. The Iranians still didn't respond until after what happened in Lebanon. I think a part of that is because they know very well the Iranian public does not want to have a war. They have a terrible economic situation. They are deeply frustrated with the repression of the regime itself. War with Israel does nothing to do some sort of a rally around the flag element. Rather, it will probably make the situation worse internally.
Is this one of those situations where the lack of American direct official contact with the leaders of the Islamic Republic really shows itself as an Achilles heel, a kind of long-standing, longitudinal weakness?
Yes, but it goes both ways. It is to the detriment of the Iranians not having a much more open, regular, and broad-based channels of communications with the United States. It is to the detriment of the United States not to have the same with Iran. The risk of miscalculation dramatically increases. The risk of misperception of what the other side is doing and why they're doing it and the signals they're trying to send dramatically increases. And we are now on the verge of war, and we still have not established real proper channels of communication. And we're on the verge of war at the time when the Iranians have a president that actually is reaching out to the US and is signaling very strongly that they're actually eager to get back to the negotiating table to restart talks about their nuclear program. That is, of course, something that Netanyahu views as a threat. Biden should view it as an opportunity, but we're not seeing any effort. And I don't expect there to be any effort to capitalize on that before the elections. The question is, will the opportunity exist 4 weeks from now?
Given where we are right now, are there more and less catastrophic near-term consequences? What should the world be looking out for at this point?
I think a critical thing is to see what the Israeli response is. If Israel hits military targets in Iran, there will likely be an Iranian response, but it will be kept to military targets. If Israel does to Iran what it has done in Lebanon now, with targeting civilian sites, economic sites, then we will likely see the Iranians go in that direction as well. But the exchange of fire between Iran and Israel thus far has remained at the military level. If it's kept at that level, it's not a good thing, but it is less bad than if it actually goes completely out of control.
One effect of the conflict in southern Lebanon is that Gaza seems to have faded into sort of a sideshow of this whole thing. Do we even know day to day what the situation is there? Can Israel continue to prosecute some kind of ongoing military operations there while it fights Hezbollah?
Well, I think it tells us something about how the media landscape has become. Nothing has really changed in Gaza. The Israelis are continuing to bomb, in the words of Biden himself, indiscriminately. Civilian deaths are increasing by the day. It's just not getting the attention any longer because now, of course, all eyes have been shifted towards Lebanon. And it will stay that way, particularly if it ends up in a situation in which the Israelis conduct their war in Lebanon similarly to how they conducted it in Gaza, in which we saw a complete devastation of the civilian infrastructure, complete destruction of villages, cities, neighborhoods, in what they said was a war against Hamas, but at the end of the day, completely has destroyed Gaza itself. If that is what is being pursued by Israel in southern Lebanon, then obviously what's happening in Lebanon is going to continue to suck almost all of the oxygen of the media coverage. It is also in that case a testimony of what will happen when the United States does not put any type of restrictions or barriers, including ignoring its own laws on how war is being conducted by an entity that we are arming and politically protecting. And this is where what Harris said, that it matters how Israel conducts the war. We'll see if she wins, if that actually has any operational meaning.
Trita Parsi is the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Reporters are best when they're covering, detailing, exposing the just recent past and how it explains the present. Crystal ball gazing makes you look good when you're right and reminds you what you should really be doing when you're wrong. After October 7th, as I tried to figure out the U.S.-Israel dynamic, I got some things right and wrong, but privately. Looking back, I figured the catastrophic loss of life in Israel last October, the twin blows of missing the impending Hamas attack, and his long history of implicitly empowering Hamas as a counterweight to the Palestinian Authority would combine to doom Benjamin Netanyahu and create an opening for Joe Biden to just look past him. And in watching for those outcomes, I hadn't counted on Netanyahu's or Biden's behavior since, and here we are. About a year later, Biden's in his last months in the White House, Netanyahu's still prime minister, and the war is widening. Zack Beauchamp is a senior correspondent at Vox, where he covers challenges to democracy in the United States and abroad, right-wing populism, and the world of ideas. Beauchamp was the longtime host of Worldly, Vox's weekly podcast on foreign policy and international affairs, and he's back on Shifting Ground. Zack Beauchamp, welcome back.
Hi, Ray. It's great to be back.
When we last spoke, part of our conversation then was about Joe Biden's commitment to protecting Israel. The world has changed then, most notably Biden bowing out of the 2024 presidential election. Before we dive into the most recent developments in Israel and Lebanon, how is the Biden administration dealing with this issue during its final months in office?
You know, it actually hasn't changed that much since he departed the race. Now that the political constraints are off, Biden's doing basically the same thing, right? And it amounts to this: extended diplomacy and significant investments, both in public and in private, in the idea of a ceasefire. It started with the front in Gaza, and now increasingly they're working hard on a ceasefire in Lebanon. And what's strange about it, though, is that it feels like we're in this constant Charlie Brown getting the football taken away from him by Lucy moment, where Lucy is Benjamin Netanyahu and Charlie Brown is the United States, right? They keep holding out the ceasefire, and it's just Israel, or you can play the blame game on both sides, and both sides do like to blame them, but there's very clear reporting that Israel had in theory accepted or been okay with the proposal the U.S. was offering, and then at the last minute, Netanyahu, feeling some political pressure from his right flank, says no. And so the Biden people keep trying to engage in these kinds of diplomatic overtures to him, and they keep being rebuffed and yet being strangely unwilling to use the significant sticks at America's disposal, specifically holding up military assistance, in order to pressure the Israeli government to follow its patron's line.
When we talk about his right flank, I think you're referring to the heavily religious parties, the parties small but very much present in his coalition, with very strong links to the Jewish population in the occupied territories. A vital part of his coalition. It basically keeps him in work, doesn't it?
It's important to understand the three-part structure of Netanyahu's governing coalition. So his party, the Likud, has a plurality of seats, but they rely on two blocks of partners to align with them. First are the ultra-Orthodox, who care less about security issues than they do about preserving their own standing and their own special privileges in Israeli society. Foreign policy is not their reason for being in government. The second group, on the other hand, which in Israel would be called the national religious, to distinguish them from the ultra-Orthodox, because their religiosity is deeply bound up in their nationalism, an extremely hawkish version of nationalism, those parties are extreme right. The version of religious nationalism they've embraced is one that believes that Israel has a right to all of the land between the river and the sea, and is justified in taking pretty extreme steps in order to secure that land. And those parties, right, they are part of an umbrella called religious Zionism. The religious Zionism parties have been extremely willing to publicly threaten Netanyahu and say, we will leave the government if you agree to these American peace proposals. So you hear conflicting things from observers inside Israel as to how much or how seriously one should take the threats coming from these extreme groups, because they still benefit from being in power, and they likely wouldn't be if the government collapsed. But it does seem to be something that Netanyahu takes seriously and formulates a lot of his policy around.
Knesset watchers in the weeks after the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israeli soil said with a great deal of confidence that whenever this thing ended, when the, in effect, National Unity War Cabinet was dismantled, Netanyahu was gone. There was no way he could hang on. I wonder how durable that idea is. As you look at what he's up to, does he imagine that he does have a life after the rockets stop flying and the bullets stop flying?
So Netanyahu wants nothing more than to stay in power. This is for a combination of ideological reasons. You know, he is a right-winger, a committed ideological right-winger himself, but he's also motivated, I think now more than anything else, by his desire to avoid going to jail. Remember, through all of this, it somehow gets missed in a lot of American conversations about this, but it's essential to understanding what's happening. The prime minister is on trial, right? The trial has been ongoing during the war. It was paused for a little bit after October 7th immediately, but resumed in, I believe, December. And he's on trial for very serious corruption charges that, if he is convicted on, could lead to like quite a bit of jail time. And he wants to avoid this no matter what. And his best pathway to avoiding that, aside from winning in court, which who knows if he can, the evidence is pretty damning against him, is to stay in power and change the law so he can't be sent to jail while he's in power. So much of the way that he thinks about policy right now is oriented around politics. And now his poll numbers have started ticking up. Now, this is surprising, right? For all the reasons that you said earlier in this conversation, the reason there seems to be a change in fortune has been a focus on Lebanon rather than Gaza. There's some very good analysis by an Israeli pollster who's been suggesting that Netanyahu's numbers would go up for a while. Her name's Dalia Scheinlein. And her argument is that Israelis feel a sense of hopelessness when it comes to Gaza, a sense of doom, a sense that they're not accomplishing anything, and that the hostages in particular are hanging there and very likely to die if there won't be a deal that Netanyahu won't agree to. And even then, if they make a deal, it's still a bad choice because it incentivizes more hostage-taking in the future from Hamas. But when it comes to Lebanon, Israel feels like it's on the front foot, right? That they're dealing with a problem, somebody that has unambiguously attacked them and continued been firing rockets since October 8th in support of Hamas's actions, and that Israel is finally on the offensive doing something that could make a difference, right? A more attainable goal than destroying Hamas, whatever that means. Nobody still knows what it means. and bringing the hostages home. So Israelis think the government has a better approach to that than they do in the first area, and so they approve of the government's actions more when attention shifts to Lebanon.
During the first months of the conflict, the rest of October, November, December, into the turn of the year, there was fury at Netanyahu. Implication from the peace wing that he was ready to countenance the death of all the hostages in order to achieve his political goals. Members of the war cabinet openly questioning in public whether Netanyahu really wanted to end the war. I mean, it looked pretty precarious by turning the attention to the increasingly restless West Bank and then to Lebanon. Has Gaza almost faded into the background?
I think yes and no, right? I think that there is a distinct sense among the Israeli political and military leadership that the threat on the northern border has become intolerable. And while what they've been doing with Hamas has been successful at minimizing the threat in the near term, that's their view. I think it's correct, incidentally, but they're right that it would be very difficult under present circumstances for Hamas to engage in an offensive inside Israeli territory. Hezbollah has been firing rockets for almost a year now, and they've been doing so in ways that have displaced, I believe the most recent estimate is 60,000 Israelis in northern Israel, right, who just can't live under the rain of rocket fire coming in there. That's not to say that the situation is the same for these Israeli civilians as it is for Gazans who are facing much more dire straits. But it means that from Israel's point of view, this is a problem that needs to be dealt with, and it hasn't been dealt with adequately. So they're turning their attention towards what they see as unambiguous aggression. And the term they use is escalate to de-escalate, is to create such a sense of danger and threat among Hezbollah, which isn't, I think, a more precarious political situation than Hamas is in some ways, and to try to pressure them into stopping their rocket fire, right? Because they might face serious consequences and blowback from a Lebanese population that has no interest in being dragged into a war, given the way the last few have worked out there. It's been horrible for everyone there. And we've already seen significant deaths from the fighting in Lebanon. So that's the Israeli thinking. Will it work out the way that they think it does? Gigantic question mark. I do think right now the attention is on trying to make that work, even as they continue operations in Gaza, right? The war isn't over and there's still operations ongoing. And I'm sure in the absence of a ceasefire, it will heat up there again. But right now, Lebanon is the primary focus.
And this seems like a good time to remind our listeners we're airing this program during the week of the first anniversary of the October 7th Hamas attacks. But of course, things are changing so rapidly that there may be things that we can't account for during the time that we're having our conversation, Zack and I, and when you hear this program. Zack Beauchamp, the reaction to Israel's attacks against Hezbollah personnel and communications has been swift, surprised, and condemnatory, but also a little uneasy. Blowing up cell phones and walkie-talkies and pagers. Hezbollah has been designated a terrorist group by the U.S. for a quarter century. It's been defined in the same way by the EU, even the Arab League. But the attacks, while they rattled the organization, upset its ability to communicate, they also killed civilians. They killed bystanders. And they brought accusations, unfair or justified, against Israel that it was using terrorist tactics to fight terrorism. Will the fallout continue, or is it already subsiding as the threat of war grows?
Yeah, look, I think that there will be a lot of concern in national security circles about this sort of thing going forward for a while. But my preliminary read of it is that will get less attention going forward than a bombing campaign, because the bombs will kill a lot more innocent people. I think that the thing that you have to struggle with, and that I do myself, is that Israel has a legitimate justification in defending itself from these Hezbollah rockets, right? Much as it had a legitimate justification to going to war in Gaza on October 7th after the Hamas incursion and the slaughter of Israeli civilians. The issue in Gaza is that the tactics that they chose to use have been so brutal and so devastating that the civilian death toll quickly became intolerable, and since has passed intolerable into the realm of, not to editorialize too much, but it seems to me to be that there are undeniable war crimes are taking place inside Gaza. Now, transplant that logic to Lebanon, I have to say I have a more difficult time with a lot of the harsh criticism coming towards the pager attack in particular. What do you expect Israel to do? The bombing campaign that came afterwards, as we saw, is almost certainly killed more civilians, right? Because bombs are just much less discriminate than a small amount of explosives packed into a pager that is theoretically, or should be, on the hip of the actual person that you're trying to kill. What is Israel supposed to do under these circumstances? Are they not supposed to defend themselves at all? Is it illegitimate?
This administration, led by a staunch, multi-decade supporter of Israel, who was already alive and a conscious, sentient being when the state of Israel was born. So this is, part of Joe Biden's life, and he can't get this right. And there's the growing suspicion, I'm sure, that there is a plan afoot, to the extent possible, to deny his administration a victory, a diplomatic victory in this part of the world.
Now, one sense that you get when you talk to people who are familiar with what's going on inside Israel is that Netanyahu really hopes to be able to wait out the Democrats. And this is consistent with many years of his political behavior, going back to the Obama administration, at least, right? Is that Netanyahu has made a calculated gamble that Israel's interests are best served and his own political interests are best served through a strategic alignment with the Republican Party. The Democrats, as a sort of liberal party that has a much more diverse base, doesn't have the evangelical Christians who are America's most passionate Zionists at this point, and where the majority of Jews are Democrats, but many of those Jews are quite liberal and thus not in line with his vision of Israel, right? That the country's better off. They're better off just by putting all their eggs in the Republican basket. And that if Trump comes back to the White House in particular, there'll be no restrictions on Netanyahu's behavior, which I think is also consistent with Trump's first-term policy, which after a little bit of initial ambiguity quickly evolved into let Israel do whatever it wants. And so I think a lot of the approach now is wait it out, right? Hope that in November they get the result that they want, and once that happens, the biggest possible constraint, which is an arms embargo from the United States, or even just some arms restrictions coming up, is just not a thing that they'll have to worry about anymore. However, if Harris wins in November, I would expect a significant recalibration from the Israeli government. I don't know what they're going to do. Maybe they'll become more aggressive and truculent at first, just to test Harris and see what she'll do. And the other thing is that Biden just doesn't really have that much credibility anymore as a threatener towards Israel, right? As attempting to try to coerce them in line with his policies, because he's laid down all these red lines at various different points about what Israel's supposed to do. And they've either crossed them blatantly or sort of tiptoed up to the edge and then maybe crossed them. And who's to say whether or not they were on the right side of the red line or the wrong side. This happened in particular in an offensive in southwestern Gaza. Biden said a lot of things, and never have there been, in the past 11 months, consequences for Israel crossing what are supposedly American lines, so why would he start now? Biden still has a lot of those older liberal impulses in the way that he thinks about Israel. And it's not that he can't recognize that the country has changed. It's that his orientation towards the country is filtered through his understanding of why it exists in the first place. And it makes him very sympathetic to a lot of Israeli claims. Setting aside Netanyahu, who obviously he doesn't like. I mean, I don't really think any other world leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu. Maybe they're a handful. But he really cared about what happened to Israelis on October 7th and doesn't have the same deep emotional connection to the Palestinian cause, despite the very just Palestinian claims of dispossession and the Nakba in 1948 and the situation in the conflict with Israel that they've steadily been losing since. Harris, on the other hand, is a different animal. There's a general sense among people who work on this issue that she has been more critical of Israel's behavior in private in the Biden White House. You can see that to a degree in her public statements. And I think that Netanyahu would have good reason to be concerned that a blank check era might come to an end were Harris to become president.
To close, Zack, let's talk about the near future. Do you see forces gathering that mean that we should be ready for a long war? Maybe not all-out war, but a long war where even just a handful of weeks ago, we might have been expecting some sort of ceasefire.
I hesitate even to predict at this point, right? The Gaza war has already itself stretched on longer than many knowledgeable observers thought that it would. The Lebanon stuff is just getting started, and it's hard to know how solid the threats are domestically in Israel to Netanyahu that seem to have constrained him thus far, whether that might shift. The United States has made preventing a regional war its top priority throughout all of this. So it could be maybe Biden changes his attitude and is willing to convey some more serious concerns to Israel afterwards and saying, you guys really need to stop this because it is a gigantic threat to our interests for you to try to be bringing in Lebanon and other regional actors into this, especially given that such a war could very well pull in the U.S. directly, which I think Netanyahu wants, right? There are American military assets in the region that are designed to deter Iran, Hezbollah's patron, from doing anything, but deterrence doesn't always work. And if Israel gets aggressive enough and an American asset gets attacked in a way that the U.S. can't ignore, we're talking a really serious crisis here.
Zack Beauchamp is a senior correspondent at Vox. Zack, thanks for joining us again on Shifting Ground.
Thanks for having me, Ray. This is great talking to you.
The fighting in the Middle East is going to shake up the presidential race in these final weeks. Could it derail either candidate before November? On Tuesday, October 15th, I'll be live in San Francisco for a special conversation about October surprises and what might trip up Harris and Trump at the finish line. You can buy tickets at CommonwealthClub.org. You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.